T-Mobile is one of the largest cell phone service providers in the United States. They're easily recognized by that famous magenta logo. You don't see a lot of magenta. I am going to guess that a lot of the people watching this have had personal experience with T-Mobile, considering that they have grown their subscriber base to over 100 million US customers, placing them almost at the same level as Verizon and AT&T, with no other competitor being nearly as significant. Those are the big three. Though, in many ways, T-Mobile stands out from those other two, having disrupted the industry and in the process gaining an arguably more dedicated following. What I'm saying here is that T-Mobile is a successful company with a fairly positive reputation, but that has not always been the case. Looking back, around 2012, if you remember, that was when their commercials were centered around Carly, the T-Mobile girl. Well, no offense to her, but maybe not the most effective campaign, because they were struggling. Their sales were falling, they were losing money, and they had a terrible reputation. Most people saw them as more of a discount provider that might be able to save you some money, but you simply were not going to get the network or the service that was offered at AT&T or Verizon. In fact, those two were in their own league. They were the bigger, more reliable providers, while Sprint and T-Mobile were like the next level down. And by the way, T-Mobile was even lower than Sprint at that point. I have a separate video that focuses on what happened with Sprint, but T-Mobile would go on to surpass them in 2015 and actually acquire them in 2020. All of it is reflective of T-Mobile's incredible comeback that I think is such a great story. So in this video, I want to talk about the rise, fall, and rise again of T-Mobile. For the initial rise, it gets a little tricky. Depending on how you want to look at it, T-Mobile technically has roots going back to the 1800s, originally formed as part of the German government. Yeah, shortly after the invention of the telephone, they started building up a network of phone lines throughout the country so the people of Germany could more easily communicate with each other. That system was mostly destroyed during World War II, but slowly rebuilt afterward, and was further expanded and modernized after East and West Germany came together. That is obviously a brief overview of more than a century of history, because everything becomes much more relevant starting in the 1990s. Laws were passed in Germany that led to their telephone system becoming a public company that would no longer be fully owned by the government. As a way to establish a brand identity to attract investors and become more competitive on the market, they renamed the system Deutsche Telecom and came up with that now iconic T logo to represent the telecom part of it. They had their initial public stock offering in late 1996, raising $13 billion, I guess making it the largest IPO ever at the time. That was followed by the sale of even more stock later on. Now, in the 1990s, telecommunications were advancing fast and becoming more competitive than ever. The obvious way to keep up with the competition was to expand globally, and the easiest way to do that was to acquire already established telecom companies in other countries. For example, almost right at the same time, British Telecommunications had agreed to acquire the American company MCI in what would have been the largest foreign purchase of a US company, though it never ended up happening. So Deutsche Telekom was looking to use that money that they had just raised to buy some foreign telephone companies. They bought separate ones all around Europe, in England and Austria, Slovakia. They even attempted to buy a massive one in Italy for $82 billion. That also never happened. Today, Deutsche Telekom is the third most valuable company in Germany, with 78% of the revenue coming from international operations. So, as part of these global expansion efforts in 2001, they acquired a US wireless provider called VoiceStream for $35 billion. Seemingly a high price for the country's 8th largest wireless carrier, with only 2 million subscribers, but the US wireless market was believed to have amazing potential, and since VoiceStream was one of the few providers that was not already part of a much larger company, this was their way in. Soon after, they completely rebranded VoiceStream as T-Mobile, taking that T from their existing logo. So that's it. That's how T-Mobile seemed to pop up out of nowhere in the United States. The wireless market was taking off. It was supported by a large company making significant investments, with a memorable ad campaign featuring actress Catherine Zeta-Jones and their slogan, "Get More." T-Mobile became one of the the fastest growing wireless brands, reaching 25 million subscribers within a decade. To be clear, never coming close to the market leaders. I mean, how could they possibly? But all things considered, T-Mobile was a relatively new, successful brand that really started to lose momentum. One of the possible reasons behind the trouble was having a weak network. So many complaints about dropped calls and lack of coverage, and that's aggravating to the customer. That is the kind of thing that will make them avoid T-Mobile in favor of more reliable competitors. At the end of 2012, they were the only one of the big four that had yet to launch their 4G LTE network. I do not want to get very technical with any of this, but they were falling behind and developing a negative reputation because of it. Another potential reason for the struggles would be a failed attempt to merge with AT&T. Yeah, the two companies tried to combine together in a $39 billion deal that would have created the biggest carrier on the market. However, the FCC and the Department of Justice felt that the industry wouldn't be competitive enough if that happened, so they ultimately gave up on it, and the whole attempt ended up being a huge waste of time and money. Finally, T-Mobile was also struggling because they were the only one of the big four carriers that did not offer the iPhone to their customers. I realize that might not sound very significant, but that was a very desirable phone with a dedicated fan base, so you can imagine how many customers were passing on T-Mobile simply because they wanted an iPhone. All of these factors came together to put T-Mobile in a questionable position. They were declining financially and maybe even becoming the laughingstock of the industry. That is not where you want to be, so they made some changes to try to turn things around, starting in September of 2012 when they named a new CEO, John Ledger, who completely changed the direction of the company. If you're not familiar with him, I'm just gonna say that he is a bit of a character, outspoken and unconventional, not the type of person you would typically see running a major company like this, though maybe the perfect person to do it if you're looking to shake things up. I think this is interesting. T-Mobile had a rule where people who worked at the stores were not allowed to have visible tattoos or piercings, and one of the first things he did was get rid of that rule. Probably not too significant in itself, but it represents his rebellious attitude and refusal to accept rules without questioning them. Here's what I'm leading to here. He did not like the way that the industry operated. Early on, he says that he would listen in on customer service calls so he can learn the biggest complaints that people had against them. He found out that people were aggravated with T-Mobile and the other phone carriers because everything was so confusing and complicated. The phone that you got would be a lower price if you got it with a 2-year contract, but then you can't upgrade it until a certain time or switch to a different company without paying to end that contract. Not to mention overage fees and whatever unexpected costs you see on your bill every month. It is a tricky system that I'm sure has aggravated most of us at some point. Ledger even said that if a Martian came to Earth to try to understand how it all works, he would end up just going right back home. So his idea for T-Mobile was to become the Un-carrier, different from all the others in that they are straightforward and simple with everything. No bundles, no contracts, basic rates, easier upgrades, pretty much eliminating all of that tricky stuff that was aggravating everybody. They would go so far as to pay the fee to cancel your contract with your existing carrier if you switched over to T-Mobile. A lot of the advertisements directly put down the competitors, and Ledger himself would insult them all the time, sometimes using offensive language and maybe taking it a bit too far. You see that? Trash talking the competitors is not something that you would typically expect from a CEO, and the others have since responded with some major changes meant to compete with the Un-carrier, so they really did disrupt things. People appreciated the honesty and transparency, and it made T-Mobile stand out, especially with the younger customers. Their customer base has more than tripled in size, adding millions of them every year, but it wasn't just from that initiative. Acquisitions have continued to be a big factor. Obviously, the one with Sprint in 2020 caused a big spike in customers, but another significant one is when they bought Metro PCS in a deal that closed in 2013. For one, the deal helped grow their presence in the prepaid market, but for two, the deal helped T-Mobile strengthen their network. They acquired assets from Metro PCS that they utilized, but also it allowed them to do this reverse IPO type transaction that resulted in T-Mobile US becoming a public company that raised money from the sale of stock that was used to strengthen their network. In 2013, they finally launched their 4G LTE network, and to take it a step further, in 2019, they claimed to launch the first nationwide 5G network. Yeah, it's all kind of intangible and hard to compare, but T-Mobile has invested a lot of money to make it bigger and better. Everyone has their own experience, but I think almost anyone would agree that it is significantly better than it was back in 2012, maybe even among the best at this point. The last factor of the comeback that I'm going to talk about is the iPhone. I don't have too much to say about this, but T-Mobile finally made a deal with Apple where they could start selling the iPhone in 2013 when they were already on the iPhone 5. It was a little late, but I'm sure broke down a barrier that had previously detracted loyal Apple consumers. To finish things up, John Legere left the company right when the Sprint merger happened, and they have continued to grow from there, reaching an all-time high in sales every single year since they became the Un-carrier, and reporting profits every year as well. By almost any measure, T-Mobile has been one of the biggest success stories over the past decade or so, and may continue to get bigger. They have essentially closed that gap to catch up to AT&T and Verizon, so it's going to be interesting to see where things go from here. They look completely different today when compared to back then, so how are they going to look in the future? Let me know in the comments, what do you think about T-Mobile? How do they compare to any of the other carriers? And if you have been with them for a while, how has that changed over the years, as far as coverage and pricing and billing and everything else? I mean, given all this information, I would guess that they are better now, but what has been your experience? Did this video make you want to switch over to them, or maybe away from them for some reason? And any other thoughts you have about T-Mobile or Deutsche Telekom or anything else in this video, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say.